we're gonna try not to cut it or anything like that. So you don't have to worry about the editing. We're gonna try and use it live, whatever. That's why I wanted to keep it short. So I'm aiming for like 30 minutes. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So joining us is Thomas Hegghammer, who is the author of this wonderful book that I actually read, 500 pages, I think. It was a heavy lift. I wish I had my copy that I could hold it up for you, but it's called The Caravan, Abdullah Azzam, and the Rise of Global Jihad. Thomas, tell me why you actually was motivated to write this book.
So the main reason is that Abdullah Azzam, the central character in the book, was very important for the evolution of the jihadi movement and groups like Al-Qaeda. And so so Abdullah Azzam was, for those who are not familiar with him, was a Palestinian Islamist activist who moved to Afghanistan during the Soviet occupation in the early 80s. And he facilitated the arrival of volunteers from across the Arab world, the so-called Afghan Arabs. And this became sort of the foundation from which we got a lot of the militant groups like Al-Qaeda that made a mark on history in subsequent decades. And it so happened that it was very clear to anyone who'd been reading jihadi literature in any small amount that this person, Abdullah Azzam, was very central. He was someone that they all venerated and highly respected and so on, and had been clearly very, very influential. But we didn't really know that much about him, so I wanted to fill in that gap by writing a thorough biography to understand what was it exactly that made him so influential. Why was it that he ended up in Afghanistan in the first place, and those sorts of things. So that was the one and the main motivation. The other motivation was to tell a kind of a broader story about the evolution of transnational Islamism from the 60s to the late 80s, and to do this through the optics of this one person, Abdullah Azzam. So to use a biography to shed light on broader historical processes, which is I guess a fairly common approach among academic biographers. So you write it not simply to understand that person, but you're using that person to shed light on broader things. So yeah, that was what I was trying to do.
So in 2004, I was in Peshawar, and we were interviewing one of the jihadi leaders in Afghanistan, Abdullah Rasul Sayaf, actually. And we were talking about Abdullah Azzam, and he said, well, let me take you to his grave. And Terence McKenna, who was the host of the show, the documentary I was working on, he was like, who is this Abdullah Azzam? I said, well, he's the man, he's the guy everybody talks about. So we went to his grave because he died. He was assassinated by a roadside bomb that was placed, at an exit from his home on a Friday, going to Jummah prayers with his sons, I think. So we visited his grave, and I took some pictures. I'm not proud of it, but I took some pictures just to say, here, I was here. But how difficult was it? I mean, that's 1989. He was killed, and you're writing a book. I think it came out 3 years ago, 2 years ago. Your book came out. How difficult was it to write a book like that?
It was a bit of a puzzle. I mean, because this is a man who spent time in lots of different places. So he was born in Palestine. He studied for a while in Syria in the 60s. Then he studied in Egypt. Then he moved to Jordan and worked there for a number of years. Then he moved to Saudi Arabia around 1980. And then he ends up in Pakistan. And then he's back and forth between Pakistan and Afghanistan. So right there, you have like 10 different countries. And so I went to practically all of these places. I went to the village where he was born. I went to Saudi Arabia. I went to his neighborhood in Jordan, and I went to Pakistan and Afghanistan. And in fact, I too sat down with Abdullah Rasul Sayaf to talk about Abdullah Azzam. So this was basically a decade-long project.
Wow.
Of going around, talking to people, collecting documents, and also sitting down and reading the rather large paper trail that he had left behind in the form of books and articles and videos and so on. So yeah, I probably could have written it much faster, but it would have been a more superficial account. So yeah, but it was really fun to work on.
Yeah. He was called, I think I remember you saying this, he was called the Jordanian Sayyid Qutb, right? Or something along that line. And tell me, what is the connection between his ideological frame of mind and that of Sayyid Qutb? Connect the two men, if you can.
Right. So Sayyid Qutb is one of the sort of two big names associated with the early Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. This sort of first Islamist organization. The other person being, of course, Hassan al-Banna, who was sort of a generation earlier. And so Sayyid Qutb is was an Egyptian teacher who became active in the Brotherhood and wrote several very influential books before his arrest and execution at the hands of the Nasser regime in Egypt in the mid 60s. Now, Abdullah Azzam is a sort of well, I guess it's sort of a generation or half a generation later. So Abdullah Azzam is born in 1941. So he's in his teens when Sayyid Qutb is executed. And Abdullah Azzam is very, very heavily inspired and influenced by Sayyid Qutb. Now, Azzam was introduced to the Muslim Brotherhood organization and its worldview before Qutb's execution. He was introduced when he was in school as a 12 or 13-year-old by his local teacher, because this is how the Brotherhood often operated, through the school system. And so he was active in the Brotherhood on the West Bank from the sort of late 50s onwards, and that's how he started. He got to read Sayyid Qutb, and when Sayyid Qutb was executed, he was furious. And the apocryphal story has it that he sent this sort of symbolic sort of telegram to the Egyptian government expressing his anger anonymously, apparently. But anyway, for the rest of Azzam's life, he would express admiration for Sayyid Qutb and cite him extensively in his writing. So he was clearly very, very much marked by his ideas. But they were of different. They never met, and they lived in slightly different times. So you can say that the influence of Sayyid Qutb was kind of more on the broader worldview rather than the sort of the specific political strategies, because in any for any movement or activist, the specific strategies or tactics you use will depend on the time you're living in, the specific political challenges, and so on. So Azzam later sort of became famous for his kind of interpretation of what jihad should mean in the context of the Palestinian struggle and the Afghan jihad and so on and so forth. Issues that were not really as prominent when Qutb was alive, and so Qutb has nothing to say about Afghanistan and such, or the Afghan jihad, because there was no such thing. But the worldview kind of underpinning many of Azzam's views came from the Brotherhood and from Sayyid Qutb. So in many ways, Qutb was the kind of the spiritual father of Azzam, although they never met, as I mentioned.
Wow. And part of the book, I mean, the story is amazing and fascinating that you tell, and the places you took the readers. But I found really intriguing a set of chapters in sort of the middle of the book that talks about the fermentation of ideas, the generation of ideas. What do you call it? A cauldron of intellectual discussion in Jordan, or centered in Jordan, with Abdullah Azzam around it, where they were writing magazine articles and journals, and books were published. Some of them he used a pseudonym and so on and so forth, where you have some ideas that came out. And I just want you to walk us through some of those central ideas. One being global jihad, that there's something called a global jihad. How was that constructed? How did they, because jihad, as the traditional scholars would know it, would be something that would be contained in a particular place. It had a particular enemy in a particular terrain. The idea that this jihad was global. How did he come to that? What kind of debates were taking place? And then we'll walk through some of those central ones, but that's one of them. And Islamic State obviously was another one. So help me unpack what kind of debates did they have at that time?
Sure, absolutely. So there are two big things happening in the 1970s across the Muslim world, in very general terms. One is that Islamism, in a very broad sense, becomes the dominant ideological paradigm. It takes over. It starts to eclipse leftism, kind of more secular-oriented leftism, which has previously kind of inspired groups like the PLO and lots of other resistance movements across the Muslim world. So in the 70s, you see that in many countries, the student body becomes more interested in religion, and on the campuses of Cairo or Amman, there will be two very particularly active student societies, the more lefty ones and the religious ones, and as the 70s go on, the Islamists win. So it's the trendy, the dominant culture, in a way, culture and ideology. And so that's one thing, kind of a general rise in religiosity among the young. And then the other thing that happens is that among those who see themselves as Islamists in this period, there's a new kind of type of Islamism that emerges, one that is much more international in its outlook, and I refer to this as pan-Islamism, meaning a type of Islamism that seeks to kind of encapsulate all the Muslim world. They talk a lot about the Ummah as as the kind of the relevant political unit. They talk about a lot about the kind of solidarity with Muslims in other countries. They spend a lot of time talking about the various problems and challenges and difficulties that Muslims in other countries have. So you start getting kind of magazines and books in the late 70s that are kind of just catalogs of kind of famines and wars and reports of discrimination of Muslims in different countries around the world where there are Muslims. And this is new, relatively new. I mean, not completely new, of course, because I mean, there's always been a sort of a notion of an ummah and a notion of solidarity among Muslims. But the difference is that among the people who were Islamists in the 30s, 40s, and 50s and 60s, this type of rhetoric about the ummah and the solidarity with Muslims far away was not very prominent. So before this, so the Hassan al-Bannas and the Sayyid Qutbs of the world were much more preoccupied with domestic politics, with kind of crafting an argument for why it was necessary to kind of change the government in Muslim countries, to depose Nasser, for example, and replace him with an Islamic regime that implemented Islamic law. So, so you have in the 70s, you have not just Islamism becoming the dominant kind of general worldview. You also have this new branch of Islamism emerging that's more international in outlook. And this international kind of current is, I think, very important to understand the violent Islamism that you get later on from the 1980s onwards. Because, to cut a long story short, what happens is that in the late 70s, people get those who are in this sort of new internationalist trends get very worked up about the state of the ummah and the amount of suffering that Muslims are enduring around the world. And in the beginning, they focus on aid, on collecting money to help starving Muslim children here, or to help, after some kind of hurricane disaster there. But after a while, you start getting people who say, well, aid and all that is all well and nice, but there are all these other situations where Muslims are in trouble, in conflict, armed conflict, where people are fighting. They're being occupied by some foreign power, some non-Muslim power, or they're involved in some kind of struggle. And here, aid is not going to cut it. We need to also help them with the fight. And so what happens is sort of at the turn of the 70s or the 80s, there's a kind of a militarization of this notion of Muslim solidarity. And you see more and more people sort of shifting focus from helping others with money to helping others with their own hands and with weaponry and so on. And so that's where Azzam fits, because he is among the ones who really pushes this idea, and his main causes are Palestine and Afghanistan, and he goes to Afghanistan, also to Pakistan in 1981 to be close to the Afghan Jihad. It takes him a few years to kind of get settled and get a sense of what's going on, but then from 83, 84, he starts to really try to recruit people from around the world to come and fight alongside the Afghan Mujahideen against the Russian occupation and the Afghan communists in Afghanistan. So what he does sort of ideologically is to kind of tweak orthodoxy in a way, because the notion that there are situations that amount to a jihad is not radical in a way. I mean, it's this is fairly sort of orthodox idea in the Islamic tradition, and it's just that over the centuries, jurists have developed kind of views and interpretations that limit, or that are highly specific about the conditions under which people should get involved in this fight and how it should be waged. It kind of got tamed over the centuries. And one of the key ideas in sort of the orthodox view on jihad is that the duty to fight is primarily on the people directly affected by the aggression, and so this is an idea that is articulated by Shafi in the very early centuries of Islam, and the idea is that the duty to resist militarily falls first on the people who are directly affected, and then after some time, if it's clear that those that are directly affected cannot do it on their own, the people, their nearest neighbors are supposed to help, and then if that's insufficient, it kind of expands in concentric circles. In practical terms, that's in the 19th and 20th century, it was almost always almost always limited these struggles to local areas, and so you had lots of independence struggles, particularly in the colonial periods, that those involved would refer to as jihads, but they really mostly involved locals. What Azzam did was to say, well, if the fight is going on, if the occupiers are still there, that's in itself evidence that the locals are in trouble, that they need outside help. So he took the slightly radical position that if you have a conflict in the first place, that's a justification for all Muslims to go there and help out and fight. So this became the rationale for basically international war volunteering, which we, I guess, nowadays would call foreign fighting. Mm-hmm. People would have heard about the foreign fighters in Syria in in 2013, 14, 15, people who went to join ISIS. But that was a phenomenon that started in the 1980s in the Muslim world really, and it started largely because of Azzam's kind of ideas and activism. Mm-hmm. Now, there's another kind of step in this ideological process. So to backtrack a bit, so we first have this sort of internationalism, but sort of soft internationalism, help other Muslims with aid, and then you have this sort of militarized internationalism, help other people with weaponry and so on, and then you have this war volunteering, go and travel to the war zone and help the Muslims there resist their occupiers. The next stage in this, is what we, I guess, nowadays would refer to as the global jihad. This notion that you can and should operate also outside of war zones. That it's fine to carry out terrorist attacks in cities outside of the war zone. So you start getting much more radical tactics in a way. Now that idea of kind of out of area operations was not something that Abdullah Azzam himself advocated in his lifetime. He stopped at war volunteering, you could say, and it was his successors, people like Osama bin Laden and others who who articulated this more radical view that you can use all kinds of tactics in order to help suffering Muslims elsewhere. But to me, to my eyes, that there's a red thread here, which is about helping other Muslims. So first, it's about aid, then it's about war volunteering. But even the terrorist attacks of Al Qaeda, you look at the justifications for them, the propaganda used to sort of support it. It's fundamentally about helping suffering Muslims. So Osama bin Laden, for example, he would highlight a few sort of key reasons for doing what he was doing. It was, in the 90s, it was first the Palestinian, or the Palestinian issue, and then the Western, or the UN sanctions and blockade of Iraq, which caused hunger and hardship there. So in Osama bin Laden's mind, carrying out terrorist attacks, in American cities or in Europe, were just a logical extension of, helping other Muslims. It was just another tactic. So you help the one they were saying America and the West is colluding with Israel to kill and oppress Muslims around the world. The only way to make them stop doing this is to attack America. So it wasn't. So Bin Laden didn't attack America because he liked to see Americans suffer. He attacked it because he thought it was a strategy for, making America withdraw from the Middle East. Ultimately, what on his mind was kind of the welfare of the Ummah in a way, in a misguided way, of course. But all this is to say that so you're dealing with this kind of evolutionary tree that goes from internationalism to war volunteering to international terrorism. And Azzam is situated in the middle there, in the sort of war volunteering stage. But that stage is very important because I don't think you could have had the sort of the international terrorism stage without that middle part where Azzam talks about how important it is to help other Muslims with fighting. It was a very long answer, sorry, but
I know. It's a complex thing. But I stayed with you and I followed that argument because he was also pivotal in bringing the Salafist, sort of the benign Salafism, and marrying it with a militant Islamism, bringing the two together. He was a central figure, and I want you to sort of talk a little bit about the role he played in bringing. At that time in Jordan, Nasruddin Albani. These guys were, he'd been in Saudi Arabia, so he must have been exposed to Bin Baz and Sheikh Bin Baz in Saudi Arabia and all of these people. But they were benign. They were people who were talking about religious Puritanism or religious purity, righteousness, and following the original companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him. But Abdullah Azzam brought them in and created a militant framework around it. And that was an interesting debate, and those chapters that you dealt with that were really fascinating.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That he kind of he builds a bridge in some ways between these sort of two ideal type strands of Islamism that you have in the mid and late 20th century, which is what we call brotherhoodism, Ikhwanism on the one hand, and Salafism on the other. With the Ikhwanism being explicitly political, openly about changing politics and deposing rulers and so on, and making laws and so on. Whereas where the Salafis are more focused on kind of individual ritual um, kind of purity, and are in some cases explicitly apolitical. They shun politics and denounce people who dabble too much in it, on the grounds that this is something that should be left to the wali al-amr, the ruler in a given situation. So, well, I guess what Azzam did was to sort of create a space or meeting places where um, people from a brotherhood background who brought the politics and could talk to people from a more Salafi background who brought more of the sort of this theological and literalist approach to text, brought them together. And so he kind of Salafized the brothers and he politicized the Salafis. And this, I think, was important for a number of reasons. One was well, for one thing, it made war volunteering and going to Afghanistan popular in countries where Salafism was dominant, like Saudi Arabia. So by kind of couching it in terms more palatable to Saudi Islamism, he was able to recruit quite heavily from there, but also by introducing kind of a more literalist approach to scripture in this new activist movement, and I think that also helped generate some of the really kind of intransigent groups, very radical groups that you get from the 90s onwards. So the group Islamic Armée in Algeria, for example, all the way on to ISIS in the 2010s. These are groups that are, that have this mix of sort of politicization from the Brotherhood, but also a heavy dose of kind of literalism, which leads them to take very kind of extreme positions, but often based on the reading of some very opportunistically drawn text from the past. So, so in that sense, he was a bridge builder, and the place where he operated, so in Afghanistan and Pakistan, became this sort of cauldron, as you mentioned, for young people from around the Muslim world, and where these ideas mixed together. Let me add another important point about his ideological contribution, which is that he is the one who really first started emphasizing the importance of martyrdom in the Sunni Islamist movement. So again, early Islamists like Hassan al-Banna and Said Qutb didn't talk about it that very much. I mean, talk about it very, very much. I mean, they would, so the Muslim Brotherhood would refer to people who were killed in conflict, like the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. They would refer to those people as martyrs, people that fall in combat. But this notion that you blow yourself up as a tactic, that suicide operations where the death of the perpetrator is the main mechanism by which harm is inflicted, that is something that only arises, well, in the 1980s among Shiite groups in Lebanon, and in the Sunni world really in the 1990s. But Azzam prepares the ground by talking very extensively about martyrdom, about the various miracles and rewards that befall the martyr, and so on. And so he began creating a kind of a culture of martyrdom in the Sunni Islamist movement. And as we all know, that tactic has been very influential in subsequent decades. So he was really a very, very important figure. But I always stress that we shouldn't go too far in our kind of assessment or condemnation of him, because it's easy to see that there are a lot of people for a long time. Azzam was kind of synonymous with Osama bin Laden. He was sort of, because he preceded and sort of inspired bin Laden, somehow thought that he was at least as bad or radical as bin Laden. That's not true. He was less radical than Osama bin Laden. He had more moderate views on tactics and so on. He never explicitly advocated suicide bombings, for example, even though he talked about martyrdom. He never advocated out of area terrorist operations and so on. So he was slightly more moderate militant, but he did prepare the grounds for what came later.
Yeah. And what about Takfir? I mean, and Hijra. Takfir, obviously, he believed in Hijra because he made it. He went to Afghanistan, which he thought was a land that could become a land of Muslims and a Khilafah and an Islamic state, which he couldn't achieve in the Palestinian struggle, even in the occupied territories. So, in a way, he gave up on the Palestinian struggle and chose instead to dedicate his life to Afghanistan, which is not his homeland. He's an Arab in Central Asia, right? But he also had strong views about takfir and hijra, right? The importance of it in the modern da'wah, proselytizing scene in terms of the calling of Muslims and what we should be about. I remember one famous story I heard in Afghanistan was the Afghanis, when the people die, they would put a flag on there to mark the grave, right? They don't have names and labels, but they have this tribal system where they put a flag that would identify the person as Pashtun or another culture, another place, wherever region they're from. And one of the Arab tourist jihadi, pulled it out and ripped it apart. And the Afghan person got very upset and saw that as an insult and shot and killed him. And Abdullah Azzam was saying that, when you're doing jihad, right, it is the highest calling. So everything else falls apart. It's kind of like he had these views about da'wah and about what was important. And the priority was obviously to struggle and to fight in the way of God. And so how do you see takfir al-hijra, those obligations, right, in terms of the war? Because he also talked about, fighting. And if in the group that you're fighting or whatever action you're taking, a person happens to be a Muslim there, he didn't go that far. He probably never talked about it. But how do you see those two things, in terms of Abdullah Azzam and where he stood in respect to that?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm assuming we're talking about the concepts of takfir and hijra, as opposed to the organization often referred to as a takfir wal hijra.
No, we're talking about a concept. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
So very simply put, Abdullah Azzam was anti-takfir. He was very opposed to this, to the notion that Muslims should go around declaring other Muslims as infidels. His view was that they should focus on fighting non-Muslims. So, and it makes sense. I mean, if you think about it, what is takfir really about? Well, it's about dealing with other Muslims whose view you don't agree with. So it's a domestic issue. The issue was there both in this Ikhwani and the Salafi community. So for the Ikhwanis, it came up in relation to dealing with regimes. So how should you want regime change, but the regime doesn't want to leave. In fact, it's fighting back at you. Can you kill Muslim police officers? Can you kill the president in your country, so on? And that's where, excuse me, people like Sayyid Qutb became dangerously close to, or some people argue, crossed the threshold of saying, if the regime is bad enough, we can consider them as infidels and therefore fight them militarily. So, on the Salafi side, this would come up often in more in terms of behavior. Like if you know, how should you deal with people who are not following a similarly strict lifestyle as you? People who, well, bury their people the wrong way, or occasionally have a glass of wine when they're on vacation in Cairo, or things like that. So, and the sort of the strict view among hardline Salafists would be to say that, you know, those, and then there are certain sort of rules, and if you break them, you're considered an infidel. Although in the Salafi case, it wasn't really so much linked to you know, calls for retribution or killing. It was just like a position. How do you consider that person? Anyway, so it's to say that takfir is a domestic debate. And as I mentioned before, Azzam represented this new internationalist trend of Islamism that tried to tone down the struggle against regimes, this revolutionary agenda that had been dominant for several decades, and to say, well, yeah, sure, we agree, these rulers are not great, we don't like them, but it's pointless to fight them now. And in any case, there are these much more urgent problems out there where non-Muslims are killing Muslims in Palestine, in Afghanistan, in the Philippines, elsewhere. So Azzam's view was that's what we should be focusing on, and revolution and takfir and all that, that's a distraction that's going to weaken us. So let's shelve it for now. Let's talk about how we are all together, how we are all Muslims, and we are facing this external enemy, and let's fight that external enemy, or those external enemies first. So that was his view in a way. So he's kind of something of an ecumenicalist, and in fact that's something you see also in some of the more radical groups that follow him. So, for example, Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, also fairly ecumenical in a way. Bin Laden, throughout the 90s, doesn't really talk that much about takfir. He doesn't need to, because his enemy is America, and they're already kuffar. So it's the same thing with Azzam. His enemy is Israel and the Soviet Union, the communists. He doesn't need takfir as a notion at all to wage his struggle. Now, of course, what happened in the late 80s, after Azzam had kind of brought in or inspired people from all over to come to Afghanistan, was that you started getting discussions again about this, where you had factions in the Afghan Arab community that said, well, yeah, this Afghan jihad is cool, but really the main thing we should be focusing on is deposing these rulers. So they were kind of reverting back to that agenda that Azzam had tried to shelve. And those people started talking more about takfir, and because this community was now quite large and kind of ungovernable, it grew in a way, and Azzam couldn't really control it. But Peshawar and so on became a place where new radical ideas of takfir grew, but it was not really of Azzam's making. Although one argument I make in the book is that Azzam is partially responsible for it, in the sense that his argument for why people should go to Afghanistan was based on a position regarding authority that was quite radical. He said, if you have a conflict involving Muslims, you should just, if you're a Muslim somewhere, you should just go. And even so, if your parents say no, you can't go, or if your local imam says no, you can't go, then Azzam says, don't listen to them. They are misled. What I'm telling you is more true, and so don't listen to these other authorities. Just listen to me and read the text I've written and just go. So Azzam had sort of, in order to get people to Afghanistan, he had opened a Pandora's box of opposition to authority, of rejection of religious authority, so that by the time of by the late 1980s, when you start to get when he started to see sort of dissent in his own ranks in Peshawar, he couldn't control it because he was now the authority, and he had just told them a few years earlier that you shouldn't listen to authority. So he was responsible for eroding a religious authority and creating a movement that couldn't be controlled, and that would later, of course, develop in lots of different directions. Some of them very, very radical.
Yeah, and I wonder what you feel about push that to the limit, because this is a critical point. If you question the authority, then what good are the books of interpretations of Islamic law, the traditional Islamic law? What good are the classics of Imam al-Ghazali or Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina and all of these people that created this ethical framework for Islamic law to be interpreted? What good are they all when you have, when you throw the authority, you throw the baby in the bathwater at the same time?
Exactly. And what you get then instead is groups that are super opportunistic in what they are citing. So they will kind of, when they see an authority figure or a medieval author that happens to say exactly what they already want to do, they will cite him or laud him or whatever. But only that, and I don't enter into the discussion. So it's a very kind of opportunistic and mix and match theology that's not coherent, because they're not really concerned with cohesion in the kind of traditional sense. They have this sort of broad general ideas about it being important to fight, and for fighting these particular people and roughly in this way. But that's pretty much it. And then everything, the theology is sort of post facto rationalization. And so, yeah, it's a kind of you get this sort of post ideological phenomena. And yeah, as you say, I mean, when you reject authority, you devalue centuries worth of wisdom and decouple yourself from it. But it does have this problematic side, which is that it's really hard to control. Once a community or a group of people have decided to reject authority, by definition, you can't influence them, at least not by argument for the first time. Maybe by charisma or kind of cultural attraction or bravado, strength, shows of bravery, that sort of thing. Maybe you can get them on your side or get them to listen to you. But the strength of argument approach just doesn't work when the kind of the links, or the trust in authority has been broken.
One last question before I let you go, and I'm really enjoying this conversation, but I know there's a time limit on it. And why do you think the Caravan has, sort of, it's still it's sort of attract a movement of people who read it, especially people, surprisingly, in the West, in Muslims in North America, for example, or Europe, are still attracted to Abdullah Azzam, and beyond the fact that he's become this iconic figure. But the book itself, The Caravan, has shown up in all kinds of dark circles, studied together and things like that, and so on, and read even as far away as Toronto, Canada, where I lived for over 4 decades. Why do you think the book is still so popular?
Oh, I think it's because it carries a very simple and powerful message that is almost universal across kind of cultures and religions. It's that you should help suffering people of your own community, and so it's not a very theologically complicated, advanced book, but it has a very sort of clear message, which is that, you know, if your people is suffering out there, help them. And this same idea, you find it elsewhere too. You find it in you know, kind of the third worldism of you know, in leftist circles in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Lots of people, you know, from Europe, non-Muslims, would go and join, you know, Marxist guerrillas in Latin America and so on, or you can go further back. People would go to the Spanish Civil War to fight the, you know, fascists there, in support of democracy. And so this notion that, you know, it's morally important and meaningful to help your community is, I think, very, very powerful, and it probably appeals to young people, you know, particularly who you know, looking for a purpose in life and something adventurous to do, and so on. And add to this that it's you know, as I mentioned, it's not a very complicated book. It's quite simply written. It has clear political examples. It mentions Palestine and Afghanistan, issues that many people care about to this day, places that they know and can relate to. You know, as opposed to some kind of you know, medieval book with complex terms and names and place names that are alien to them. You know, this is a book that is written in a language that young people can understand without a whole lot of education. And yeah, I think that's the appeal of it. There's something universal and kind of altruistic in it, that appeals to people. And, you know, there's another way of saying it's not actually a bit of a, I would argue, you know, other people may have different views. It's not a very radical book in that sense. It's not advocating suicide bombings. It's not advocating international terrorism in the kind of classic sense. It's a restrained radicalism in a way, which is, you know, I think is important to understand its appeal, because if a book goes too far, if it's advocating too extreme methods, then a new recruit, someone who's coming into this and reading this type of literature for the first time, is going to be turned off. So it kind of hits the sweet spot of winding people up a bit, but not putting them off from the content. That's where I think the appeal comes from.
And he was also a university professor, so he would have known how to point. He knows young people himself, you know.
Yeah, very important. Yeah. And he had the authority of a doctor of Islamic law to kind of go with it. So, you know, a teenager could take this book and show it to another friend and say, well, you may think this is a radical message, but look, it's an Al-Azhar sheikh who says this, so it must be true, you know. So yeah,
exactly. Well, Thomas Hegghammer, the Caravan, Abdullah Azzam, and the Rise of Global Jihad. It's a must read. I recommended it to so many people.
Thank you so much.
Read it, but it's a fantastic read, and there's so much more in there that I think for anyone who is want to be aware of you know, the state of a lot of young people and sort of this radical narrative that has been floating around for over 4 decades. It's great to read this book, and it's an eye-opener. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll let you get back to your schedule. And it's
Thank
Ramadan.
you very much for your kind words. Really
Happy
appreciate
Ramadan to you.
Right back at you.
Take care, sir. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.